My name is David Bennett. I'm the curator of maritime history here at the North Carolina Maritime Museum. And last year I did a presentation on early coastal tourism in Currituck County. This year I'm doing one on the Outer Banks. So thank you everyone who's here live and people tuning in online. So all right, so why did people go to the beach in like the 19th century? That's really kind of the time period. I'm primarily focusing 19th and early 20th centuries. It seems kind of like a sort of ridiculous question to ask because we all know why we come to the beach today, but the reasons that people back then went were totally different. So a big reason in North Carolina why people went to the beach was malaria. Believe it or not, malaria was extremely prevalent in eastern North Carolina in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries. But back then they didn't know they didn't know it was a parasite transmitted by mosquitoes, and they referred to it as ague, chills, miasma, fever, etc. Malaria or miasma just means kind of bad air. People thought that they were breathing in, the bad swamp air, particularly like in areas up around the Albemarle region, and that was causing them to get sick, which just wasn't the case. But they believed that if they went to the coast and they bathed in the salt water and they breathed in the salty air, that it would really help relieve their symptoms and possibly even cure them of the disease. And so I've got this quote from the late 18th century, this German traveler coming through eastern North Carolina. And he wrote that all the good qualities of this tea, and he's talking about Yaupon tea, and people used to drink Yaupon tea for their health back then. He said, praised as they are, cannot, however, prevent the sickliness of the inhabitants, especially in the low, overflowed, and swampy parts of this country, and giving the people a pale, decayed, and prematurely old look. This is the case not only about Edenton, but along the entire low-lying coast, which this fall from Virginia to South Carolina was visited with numerous fevers. And he's talking primarily about malaria, and he's talking about sort of how the residents look and some of their symptoms. And then, but almost 100 years later, people are talking about going out to Nags Head, the Outer Banks, and saying that the continual breezes from the ocean bring health and comfort to the suffering. Mosquitoes, fleas, and snakes are almost strangers here, and the chills are far and few between. And chills, what they're referring to, they're not talking about colds, they're talking about malaria. So even in the 1870s, and even beyond that. So where did people go to the beach? Well, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the primary locations were the sort of Nags Head, Currituck area, Ocracoke, Beaufort, Morehead City, Wrightsville Beach, Carolina Beach, and Southport. But as I said earlier, we're primarily focusing on the Outer Banks. Something to take into mind is that Dare County only came into existence in 1870. So if I can just get out my laser pointer here. So a big chunk of the Outer Banks was Currituck County, and the other chunk was part of Hyde County. So this is a map from 1832. And then in 1870, then you have Dare County is created, and it's pretty much the Outer Banks for the most part as we know it today. Of course, Ocracoke is still part of Hyde County. But anyways, Nags Head, just across from Roanoke Island. And it is pretty much North Carolina's sort of original coastal resort town that popped up in the 1830s, antebellum period. You had this man, Francis Nixon from Perquimans County. He and his family wanted to escape the malaria of the Albemarle region. And so August 1832, he purchased 200 acres from William Etheridge for $100, which would be under $3,000 in today's money, roughly. And then he started to break up this $200 piece of land into smaller lots and sell it off to friends and family and acquaintances. A good example of this is August 1842. He sold half an acre to Edmund Skinner of Perquimans County for $100. So some real sort of early real estate speculation on the coast, on the Outer Banks. And before too long, there's so many people traveling out to the Outer Banks that they needed to build a hotel. The first hotel was the Nags Head Hotel, built in 1838. It was quite large for Eastern North Carolina at the time. It could accommodate up to 200 guests. It had a large ballroom, dining facilities, bar, rooms for entertainment, stables for horses, all sorts of accommodations. And it was the center of social life on the island. People that had beach cottages, and these cottages would have been on the sound side. They weren't on the ocean side yet. Everyone would have converged on the hotel to hang out, especially at night when they had the ballroom dances. And they improved and expanded the hotel in the 1850s. They had a big wharf that could accommodate steamboats. They had a steamer that they contracted with, the H. Schultz, to bring people to the hotel. They even had a plank walkway that went from the sound to the hotel, and then from the hotel to the ocean, so you could have better access to both sides of the water for bathing and that sort of thing. And then they had these horse-drawn railroad. They had one on their wharf because people would load their baggage. So that, right in this image, you have this ox pulling this cart, and it's full of furniture and luggage, and you could get a discounted rate at the hotel if you furnished your own hotel room. So people would bring their, furniture with them. People were also bringing furniture out to furnish their cottages as well. But they also had one of these sort of horse-drawn or ox-drawn railways going from the hotel to the ocean to make access easier, especially for the elderly. So the Civil War upends everything on Nags Head. In 1862, when Confederate soldiers are retreating, they burn the hotel and a lot of the cottages out on Nags Head. And so there's no tourism really during the Civil War. However, things start to bounce back very quickly, almost as soon as the Civil War is over. A new hotel was built, the Alexina House, and it was a large hotel, 200 feet by 2 stories, on the sound side, like the Nags Head Hotel before it. It changed several hands as these hotels did over the course, and I think ultimately it ran into financial trouble and went bankrupt eventually. And on this map right here, they show approximately where the Alexina House was located on Nags Head. So then in early 1870s, you have the Nags Head Hotel Company rises up, and they build a new Nags Head Hotel. This one's bigger than the Alexina House. It's 3 stories tall. More guests, 300 guests. They had these wide verandas, or these wraparound porches that went around every story of the hotel. Ladies' parlor room for the ladies to hang out and chat with each other. They had billiards room, bar rooms, a store where you could buy stuff. If you didn't have everything that you needed when you went out on vacation, you could buy it right there at the hotel. There's an ice house for cold beverage, crush up the ice for cold beverages. And they had a larger pier so they could accommodate more steamboats. Their pier was so large they could offload horses at their wharf, because people wanted to bring their horses to ride on vacation. So it was expanded in 1881. They added some more rooms. They had a bigger and better ballroom. They enlarged their dining room by knocking out a wall between their old dining room and their old ballroom, and it had more of an open concept space for more dining tables and chairs. The rooms prior to this time period had been pretty Spartan and small, and so what they did was they updated all the rooms to the latest fashion, and they had a new off-site kitchen and bakery, and they expanded their pier. So an interesting thing about Dare County is they had prohibition early on in North Carolina in the 1880s. It says not a drop of spirits of any kind is now sold in the county, Dare County, not even brandy peaches except at Nags Head Hotel during the summer season, where they are allowed to sell to the guests of the hotel only. So locals could not purchase alcohol. And I guess they kept that going at the hotel because people on vacation want to sit at the beach and just drink. But they did have a little follow-up article noting that all the complaints so far, as we know in the county, for the past year has been against the hotel keeper for selling his liquor. So, so locals weren't happy about alcohol being sold at the hotel, or maybe they were just jealous. So again, the Nags Head Hotel has made it even bigger and better in 1890. You know, they've got more and more rooms, larger ballroom. They even have a barber shop now where you can have your hair cut. Telegraph office, so you can send messages to the mainland. So if you have a business like in Norfolk or elsewhere, you know, you can continue to do business while you're on vacation or keep in touch with people. Stables for horses. And then they had this other house just adjacent to the hotel room. It was 2 stories. It's part of the hotel. And that's pretty much what it looked like right before the demise of the hotel. So fairly large. Now, unfortunately, the Nags Head Hotel burned in July of 1903. Lamp exploded, probably like a kerosene lamp, and the hotel burned down in 45 minutes. And the owner's wife, she was so upset that she died of a heart attack on site, and she was the only casualty, the only person who died in this fire. So a lot of times when people think of Nags Head and the Outer Banks, they think of these beach cottages that are right on the ocean. So a lot of these cottages started out on the Sound side prior to the Civil War. And even after the Civil War, a lot of people had cottages on the Sound. But after the Civil War, people started building cottages on the ocean side. They can take advantage of the ocean breezes. There had been more accessibility, provided more roads, you know, going over to the ocean. And yeah, so things start, you know, in the late 1860s and early 1870s, start to take more of a shape with kind of what we know Nags Head to be today. This is kind of an example of one of the houses on the Outer Banks that you still see some of these houses around with the cedar shingles. And as you know, people rent their cottages or their houses today on the beach. People, you know, back in the 19th century, all the way back to the antebellum period, were renting out their homes to people during the summertime, and they would put the ads in newspapers like the Edenton or Elizabeth City newspaper. And this one right here, this example, that it's the house is close to the Nags Head Hotel. And then you even had some houses that were built on stilts over water. Sort of an interesting, this is on the Sound side, of course, but just sort of an interesting concept. And then, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about Manteo. There wasn't as much tourism going on in Manteo, but they did have some hotel facilities. And chief amongst them was the Tranquil House, on Manteo. And when you kind of read about it, some of the primary sources, it seems like a lot of like sportsmen like to go there, a lot of hunters and sport fishermen. And this is what it looked like. And there really wasn't a whole lot on Manteo during this time period, the 19th, early 20th century. So I'm going to talk about Currituck County a little bit. The Currituck County, sort of the 1870s and onward, the kind of Currituck County that we know, their section of the Outer Banks. So these stars here, they've got like Collington Island, and this one area right here, they've got the Currituck Seaside Hotel. It's on a map, but I could hardly find anything about it, so I'm not really going to talk about it. But there was something there possibly at one time. And then up here, where there used to be Currituck Inlet, there was also a small hotel up there. But and this is the hotel that used to be kind of up around the old Currituck Inlet. And again, this is sort of a hotel that's really kind of marketing themselves towards sportsmen. Currituck County was extremely popular with hunters, especially from up north. It was sort of all the rage. Tons of geese and swan, and they're advertising things like decoys that they're able to, you know, and they're talking about fishing, that sort of thing. One of the rental properties out there was on Collington Island is Tom Cronk's cabin. He kind of gets a little bit of fame. There's Forest and Stream magazine in the 1880s, 1890s. There's people writing about going out here and staying with this guy. He was a local fishing guide and hunting guide, and he had a cabin that he rented out to hunters. And this one sort of middle class guy said, "Oh, this is." He wrote a letter to Forest and Stream and said, "This is a great place to come stay." And then these really kind of a party of these rich guys came down a hunting trip, and then they wrote a letter and said, "It's not as nice as what people have been making out to be." And what they wrote was that, you know, you go in the living room, it's just a wood stove and a couple of chairs. And then the bedrooms are just an old bed with a hard mattress, no pillow, no sheet. And then you have to bathe yourself in a tin basin out on the porch. And that you got this separate cookhouse where, you know, Tom Cronk and his family are cooking for you, but everything's fried. And all these guys, they're there for like a week or two, and they're just completely tired of fried food by the end of it. But, you know, there's no refrigeration, so that's why people consume so much fried food in the South. So Ocracoke. Ocracoke was a popular destination, sort of going back to the colonial period, believe it or not. And you have this one source from the late 18th century noting that Ocracoke, this healthy spot, is in autumn the resort of many of the inhabitants of the Main. One of its original proprietors, who has attained his 90th year, still resides on it and does not appear to feel any of the infirmities of age. So they're kind of that salt water, salt air, being good for you, you know, that's sort of this idea that, you know, the coast is good for your health. But the tourism industry really didn't take off until the 1880s on Ocracoke. It was considered sort of a playground for the people of Washington in particular. And it was dominated by rental homes and cottages for a long time. Things kind of things got a little out of hand though in July of 1887, when they had over 1,000 people on the island and there weren't enough accommodations for everybody. And so a lot of people were having to go back to the mainland. And so some people in Washington, they got together and they said, you know, let's form a company to build a hotel, the Ocracoke Hotel, in 1887 in response to this incident. And so by 1888, there's a new hotel, and it's the Ocracoke Hotel. And this is what it looked like. So similar kind of to what they had up in Nags Head, these large multi-story, large wraparound porches, you know, very popular. There's another image of it. And by 1890, by the 1890s, they renamed the hotel to Hotel Ponder because it had changed hands, changed ownership. And it kind of has an interesting history with fires. In July 1899, it survived a fire that broke out in the sort of ballroom area. One of these oil lamps was too close to the ceiling, caught the ceiling on fire. Instead of running away from the fire, people ran up onto the second floor, cut a hole through the ceiling, and started pouring water onto the fire, and were able to put it out that way. So sort of interesting story there. But it was consumed by fire in May of 1900, and it went up in about 30 minutes. What they think happened was that there was a window that was open on the, I think on the third floor, and it was a particularly windy night, and a lamp was knocked over, and that's how the fire started. There's some notable visitors to the hotel, President Grover Cleveland being one of them, and I'll talk about him again later in the presentation. But the Democrats of Ocracoke, 1892, held a dinner for him there. And then how did people get to the Outer Banks during this time period? Because, you know, there's, unlike today, you know, today we've got these huge bridges that go out there. Back then they didn't. So getting out to the Outer Banks was more of an ordeal. Schooners was one of the primary means of transportation, like this one. So yeah, the schooner Fox was going from Hertford and Little River to Nags Head in 1849. You had schooner Sarah Porter from Edenton to Nags Head. Lovey D. Tillett from Hertford to Nags Head. It's 1850s, antebellum time period. Lizzie G. Russell from Elizabeth City to Nags Head. And then you had this schooner A. Riddick. It said leaving here, and the Old North State was an Elizabeth City newspaper, so it was Elizabeth City to Nags Head. And then here's sort of the route that these schooners were taking in the 1850s. Now, I really like this little quote here. It was this person making this observation that the wealthy travel in steamers to this local Mecca, and the poor cruise to the banks and their cunners, taking the whole establishment along, baby and all. So everybody went to the beach. So places like Nags Hotel were definitely there for the elite, but you have these smaller boarding houses, you know, and smaller hotels that probably the less wealthy were staying at. And cunner is a corruption of the word canoe. These are canoe boats, multi-log boats, and they're sailing canoes. They're not rowing canoes. So not like Native American dugout canoes. So let's talk a little bit about steamboats. So for my research, it seems like the steamboats, it was sort of mixed. It wasn't just for the rich, the elite. It depended on which steamboat you went on. Some of them were very stately and nice. Others were very humble, just sort of cargo boats. Some had fine dining. Some you had to pack your own meal. Some had really nice sleeping quarters. Sometimes others you're sleeping between, you know, boxes and barrels. So the steamer H. Schultz, its route, it went from Franklin, Virginia, down to Winton, and then down to Edenton before going out to Nags Head. And they contracted with the Nags Head Hotel to bring people out there. And so this is kind of what the sort of steamboats stopping off at these small towns, you know, in sort of Albemarle region looked like. So let me talk a little bit about steamer John Styles, because it's sort of different. This is right before the Civil War kicks off. So its route, started on Tuesdays mornings. It went from Plymouth to Jamesville to pick up people to Williamston to Hamilton. This is on the Roanoke River. Then Tuesday evenings, it goes from Hamilton back to Plymouth. Then on Wednesdays, it went from Plymouth and then picked up passengers at Edenton, and then it went to Nags Head. And then on Thursdays, it made a couple of trips back and forth between Nags Head and Elizabeth City, ferrying people. And then on Fridays, it went from Nags Head to Edenton and back to Plymouth. And then Saturdays, it went from Plymouth to Edenton, Elizabeth City to Nags Head. So varying routes depending on the day of the week. And then Sundays and Mondays, it didn't run. A really important route, or two really important routes, are the Great Dismal Swamp Canal and the Albemarle Chesapeake Canal. So this enabled vessels to come down from the Virginia Chesapeake Bay into North Carolina. So places like Nags Head were getting a lot of Virginia tourists, even back in the 19th century. So, I've got Norfolk here, the Great Dismal Swamp comes all the way down to the Pasquotank River or by Elizabeth City. And then the Albemarle Chesapeake Canal, you've got area cut here, and there's an area cut through around here. But anyways, so two routes for vessels. So the steamer Harbinger, it went from Norfolk to Nags Head certain days of the week. Other days of the week went from Hertford, North Carolina to Nags Head. And this is what it looked like when people offloaded at Nags Head or by the Nags Head Hotel. So tons of people getting off the steamboat. And then right here, this view, you got these people walking down this long pier that's hundreds of yards long. There's this little track, this narrow gauge rail track right here I mentioned earlier. And you got your steamboats and your sailboats back here. Just another view, same pier. Some wealthy individuals along the Albemarle owned these naphtha motor launches, which were these early gasoline-powered boats. There's this one story in Forest and Stream magazine where a group of friends go from Windsor, North Carolina, which is Bertie County, the western or by the western end of the Albemarle region, to Nags Head in June 1890 on a fishing trip. And they take the 20-foot motor launch, and it took them 14 hours to get to Nags Head because they ran into some bad weather along the way. Their compass broke and they got lost, turned around. But they wound up having a great time, though. It was a lot of fun. Just another way people got out there. Now, the canoe that I mentioned earlier, this kind of give you a little bit of an idea of what they sort of looked like. This is your sails right here. And there's this little blurb that I found that Messrs. H.A. Jr. and M.F. Bond and James A. Woodard Jr. came up from Nags Head on Wednesday in the canoe. Cunner is what they're referring to. Canoe and cunner tend to be interchangeable during this time period. Becky Miller, they made the run in 8 hours. So 8 hours under sail from Edenton. From Nags Head to Edenton. Pretty impressive. And all these guys were Edenton locals. So what did people do? Again, sort of a silly question, but people back in this time period did a lot of the same things that we do today at the beach. They just did it differently. And so, of course, people went to the beach and they went swimming in the Sound or they went swimming in the ocean, and they had a great time doing it. One of the big differences is that during this time period, Nags Head was this sort of desolate expanse of sand. And so getting from the Sound to the ocean wasn't the easiest, just tons and tons of sand. And you had these migrating sand hills that went along with the winds. And some people, they built beach cottages on Nags Head, and they'd get to enjoy it one year, but because of these migrating sandhills, they'd come back the next year and the house would be under a hill of sand. So just kind of interesting bit there. But to make crossing the island easier, again, earlier I sort of mentioned these boardwalks that they built from the sound to the ocean to make just walking easier instead of going through the sand. These sort of horse-drawn wagons sort of on these narrow gauge railroad tracks. Again, they had these sort of things. And they also had changing facilities on the ocean, so you can change into your swimming gear. Riding on the beach. So, today people like to ride, like to drive their trucks and stuff on the beach. Well, back then people had horses and buggies that they would drive or ride on the beach, like in this drawing here. And this is sort of what it looked like that people would have been riding around in. And this is one of the roads around Nags Head that was on the sound side. It doesn't look like much of a road at all. And it's sort of a road going through the woods around Nags Head that people would have driven through. And then this is, I really, even though this is a really grainy, messy photo, you've got this horse and this little buggy that it's clearly on the ocean side on the beach. And you got people that are out swimming in the water. And this is probably one of the earliest photos that I've found of people, going swimming on the Outer Banks. So one of the things people did was they went out and they go visit these U.S. Life-Saving Service stations that were along the Outer Banks. These surfmen, they had some downtime, when they weren't training or, trying to rescue stranded ships. Usually during the summertime, a lot of these places would be closed, but the keeper would be around. Later on, they started having more of a closer to a year-round schedule, but they'd go hang out with the keeper of the surfmen, talk to them, see what their lives were like, just out of curiosity. They'd go fishing with these folks, especially in the winter times. Where you really hear about this is in the wintertime, when these surfmen were at these stations and these hunters would come down, or these sport fishermen would come down, and they'd have clam bakes and oyster roasts. And sometimes they'd even stay overnight for free at these facilities. Tourists were also very interested in shipwrecks, tons and tons of shipwrecks along the coastline of the Outer Banks during this time period. And people would go check them out, and they would break pieces off of them or take flotsam and jetsam as just sort of souvenirs to take home with them. And so they would see stuff like this, like a schooner, run up on the beach, or something like this, a completely wrecked ship up on the beach. But one of the most popular shipwrecks was the wreck of the Huron, which was a really, really devastating shipwreck on the Outer Banks that garnered a lot of national attention. And the wreck site was not far from the Nags Head Hotel. And there's these ongoing salvage operations. The James Power and Company, they had the contract for the salvage work, and they were using divers, but they're also using dynamite on this wreck. This wreck was out in the water. And so people would gather on the beach and they would watch as explosives were being used underwater, and you'd have these plume of water going 200 feet up in the air in this, massive explosion. So it was really fascinating, something really interesting going on to people to watch. Lighthouses. So there's a lighthouse out in Ocracoke. People would go and visit them like we do today and admire them. Lighthouse out Body Island. And I'm not showing the Hatteras Lighthouse for a reason, because during this time period, Hatteras wasn't really developed. It was a small fishing village. There wasn't a whole lot going on down there. Around sort of the turn of the century, they do get a small hotel, but it's not really a real summer tourist destination at that time. But so it's really the areas that are really kind of around Ocracoke and closer to Nags Head that get the attention at the time. Exploring sandhills. So I know a lot of folks, you like going to Jockey's Ridge. You had more big sandhills during this time period than you do today. That's because you have development on the Outer Banks, and they've planted a lot of grasses and, stabilized the area. One of the really popular hills was Engagement Hill. It was one of the largest sand hills, and at one time it was even taller than Jockey's Ridge. And there's all these fascinating stories. One of the interesting stories is from 1857. There is a man who he had met this young woman at a ball, and he became infatuated with her. And he took her up onto Engagement Hill with the intention of proposing to her. He proposed, and she said no. And even though they're up at the top of the hill, and maybe people couldn't have heard the conversation, people saw one person walking down alone and the other person standing at the top, sort of dejected. So it's very public when an engagement proposal went wrong, and it could be very humiliating. Other times, people would be very happy and excited, and and sometimes they'd go up there at night. But there's one quote. It's very sort of Victorian, very kind of over the top, exaggerated, but it said, "Sacred to Cupid, oh, could this mute sands a tale unfold, what words they tell of love that breathes and thoughts that burn." So someone sort of waxing poetically about Engagement Hill. People would also make excursions to Roanoke Island just to find something to do. There were things to do out there. There were sandhills on Roanoke Island, kind of like there were out in Nags Head, that people would go explore. There were also this sort of people would romanticize the history of Sir Walter Raleigh and the lost colony, and they'd go and see where it was, and just talk about history and let their imaginations run wild. There's also, more disturbingly, an Indian burial ground on Roanoke Island that it seems though the tourists would go dig up and take things as souvenirs, which is pretty disturbing. And then there's also remains from Civil War fortifications on the island that people would go explore. There's also a Scuppernong vineyard, Scuppernong grape vineyard on the island, a big one, very old one, that people would go and get grapes from the owner. And there's also watermelons on the island to be had. So sailing was a big one. Last year when I talked about Carter County, like sailing was massive for the tourism industry. It's important for the Outer Banks, but not in the same way as it was for Carteret County. You had people with cunners, primarily fishermen, that, when they weren't operating in summer, they would take people out on cruises and fishing trips. In the shad boat, North Carolina shad boat was a big one. This photo isn't of the finest quality, but these guys, they're holding fishing rods. And so probably what this photo is showing is a fishing guide, either about to take, a group of sport fishermen out to go fishing in the sound or around the inlet. And of course, they had these daytime cruises, in Carteret County, and down around Wrightsville Beach, they did these evening cruises as well. I haven't found any evidence that they did it up around Nags Head or Ocracoke. The waters are a little more iffy. Maybe around Ocracoke, I don't know. Now for Ocracoke, there's a lot of people with boats from Carter County that came to provide fishing trips and sailing excursions, because there was so much competition within Carter County that people were going to Wrightsville Beach and to Ocracoke to try and make some money. A good example is you have these three Willis brothers from Morehead City. They take their Sharpies out to Ocracoke to do these sailing and fishing excursions. One of the brothers starts up a little sort of touristy shop on the island, and he's running it. And for whatever reason, something obviously didn't go right. In June 1896, there's a group of 35 local men from Ocracoke approach these three brothers, and they run them off the island and sort of threatening them with violence if they don't leave. Maybe they were sort of these Carter County guys were cutting into these Ocracoke folks into their business. Who knows? On Ocracoke, they had these July 4th races, the sailboat races, just like they did this in Carter County as well. Very popular. 4th of July celebrations on Ocracoke were a big deal. So recreational fishing, as it is popular today, it was very popular back then, but different. So back then, people weren't going that far offshore. They're more confined to the sounds and to the more of the, if they are going offshore, if they're staying closer to the shore. So they're going after things like croaker, white perch, pigfish, sea bass, trout, striped bass. Sheep's head was a very popular one. And the bluefish was really the main sport fish at the time. It had the most fight to it. You notice I didn't talk about marlin or sailfish because they're not going that far offshore. They're staying, like I said, in the sounds or near shore when they're going out in the ocean. And there's this one interesting story from this fishing trip at Oregon Inlet. So on day one, you've got these 5 guys are on a boat and they catch 800 spot and trout in 4 hours. So pretty much you're putting the line in and pulling a fish out practically. Day 2, they catch 300 trout. Day 3, they caught 25 trout in an hour, and they consider that to be a disappointment. And these guys were staying at Collington Island for $1 a day for their trip. There is even freshwater fishing around Nags Head. They have these big freshwater ponds on the island, and so when if the winds were too high and the water a little too rough, rather than go saltwater fishing, people would go freshwater fishing. And I like this picture because it looks like you have a sand hill about to roll into this freshwater pond. Now, occasionally some bigger fish were caught out towards Ocracoke. So as I said earlier, drum and trout were very popular. But in July 1891, there's one sport fisherman who caught a 12-foot swordfish, which was big for the time period. Would have been closer to something that people were going after today. In July 1893, Colonel Williamson caught a 100-pound bonito, which is this fish here on the bottom. So starting sort of gradually or closer to the turn of the century to get into bigger fish. Believe it or not, clamming on Ocracoke was a popular tourist pastime. There's tons and tons of clams around Ocracoke, and people just went off and harvested them by hand. Crabbing was another popular thing. You know, they're just taking people, a lot of times kids or adults were taking just a line and tying like a piece of chicken or whatever off to it and dipping it into the water and letting the crab grab onto it and just pulling the crab out of the water that way. Now, hunting was huge in terms of tourism for the Outer Banks and for Ocracoke. It provided a year-round form of tourism. But the bird hunting back then was a lot different than it is today. It was more of a slaughter of birds. Edward Prey, this one northern hunter that spent a lot of time around Currituck County, Dare County, he was hunting with a 6-pound Scott breech loading gun. So quite a large gun. Jesse Etheridge was a local hunting guide, hunted with a 20-pound 40-inch shotgun, and he killed 37 duck with one shot. He killed 10 geese on the water. They weren't even in flight with one shot, so not very sporting. And he killed 7 geese in flight with 2 shots. So, you know, you had the ability with things like punt guns, these massive guns, kind of like this right here, to basically decimate entire flocks. And then this is sort of a, you know, a morning's worth of hunting at Nags Head. One of the interesting things during this time period is the decoys. We think about you know, the wooden carved duck decoys, but during this time period they were also using live decoys. So they're using, you know, waterfowl or swan that were alive. They clip their wings and they tie their leg with a piece of thin piece of rope and anchor them in the sound. And so they'd be alive and active, and they would attract other birds. And they were bred for this. And so hunters could just wipe out these flocks. And there's even some hunting at night with fire, which was illegal in North Carolina, but it was still practiced. And so you got this picture here, these guys out in the Outer Banks hunting with dogs. And there's this one quote from the News and Observer in 1881. Northern men will soon own all of the best shooting grounds in North Carolina and have, in fact, bought all the best duck, brant, geese, and swan shooting grounds in Currituck and Dare counties. And so you had these groups of wealthy northern businessmen who had these hunting clubs on the Outer Banks, and they're buying up massive parcels of land and water for exclusive hunting rights. President Grover Cleveland was very much into hunting and fishing, and in July 1894, he was on a trip, hunting and fishing trip to Ocracoke. Visited the Ocracoke Hotel again, and he was with Secretaries Carlisle and Gresham. You had the Secretary of War Daniel S. Lamont, December 1896, went waterfowl hunting at Ocracoke. Or the Hotel Ponder, which previously was the Ocracoke Hotel, provided the decoys and boats. Deer hunting was popular, particular sort of like, you know, on the mainland section of Dare County in particular. And then there's even sort of, so that's all the daytime entertainment. Now, a little bit about the evening entertainment, because there was a nightlife and dancing. Ballroom dancing was sort of the big thing to do in the evenings. And the style of the late 19th century was something called the German, which it's the sort of form of party dancing. If you look it up online, the dances are kind of a little ridiculous looking. They had different themes, and some of them were comedic. So they're, look it up, it's kind of interesting. But this was also, you know, how men and women were mingling in more intimate ways, and, you know, young men and women would kind of meet, become infatuated, and go run off into the night with each other. And sometimes they go off on these nighttime sort of romantic walks by moonlight on the beach. After these dances, they'd run off to Engagement Hill and I guess propose, maybe. Then there was something called, on Nags Head, people went searching for these quote unquote phantom lights. It's kind of like ghost hunting at the time. And the story was that in the late 19th century, that on the water between Roanoke Island and Nags Head, there is this phantom light that would appear hovering just above the water. And the light would move towards you and then all of a sudden vanish and then reappear elsewhere. And apparently all the kids and teenagers and stuff would go out looking for this phantom light at night. Sort of a nighttime adventure for kids. And so storms, they're part of the tourist experience on the Outer Banks. Of course, this is before you have National Weather Service providing early warning for people to evacuate. So tourists inevitably were caught up in hurricanes. August 1879, there was a big hurricane that hit the Outer Banks. It tore the roof off the Nags Head Hotel. And it blew sand through the building. All the exterior structures were destroyed. Communication with the mainland was cut off. And the people in Raleigh, the devastation was so bad in Eastern North Carolina, the people in Raleigh had this sort of crowdfunding movement to provide relief for the people of Eastern North Carolina. The storm was so bad. Then you had this massive hurricane that hit the Outer Banks in August of 1899. At Nags Head, the flooding was so bad that the men from the U.S. Life Saving Service came out and were going from cabin to cabin rescuing people, or cottage to cottage rescuing people, and they're running ropes from cottage to cottage that people were pulling themselves through the water along these lines with children strapped to their back, trying to get to the sandhills, to get on top of the sandhills in the middle of a hurricane to survive. That's the kind of storm that hit in 1899. And this isn't necessarily from that storm, but it's a storm that hit the Outer Banks and sort of the devastation that they had around the turn of the century. So that same storm that hit the Outer Banks in August 1899 hit Ocracoke. Ocracoke, they had 20 to 30 foot waves hitting the island. And the flooding was probably just as bad or as worse. And there's this there's this quote from this guy reflecting on the storm years later. He said that at Ocracoke Hotel, which was Hotel Ponder at the time, when the water was running on the floor of the dining room and the guests were on the tables praying and wringing their hands, a large black Negro man, the cook, shouted, "White folks, let's go to the Lord in prayer." Everybody kneeled and he prayed as no one at Ocracoke ever prayed before or since. When the Negro had finished, the wind had shifted and the waters receded. So very traumatic experiences for families on vacation on the coast. And so just sort of leaving the Outer Banks, or leaving from vacation, a lot of times you don't want to go back to work to the real world. And people back then felt that as well. You had the Reverend Thomas Dixon Jr. wrote about Nags Head and leaving it. He said, here civilization seems like a nightmare, and life in a great, steaming, filthy city comes back to one as a memory of a night of half fever and half delirium. Here life is worth living. I left Nags Head like a child sent back to its hard, unwelcome task. And so that's all I've got for you all. That's the presentation on early tourism on the Outer Banks. So do y'all have any questions? It's pretty good. Okay. Let me see if I have any questions? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. I know about that one.